1968. We start off the year in 1968 with what's known as the Tet Offensive, right? I know that I don't pronounce it correctly because I can't speak Vietnamese and nobody would teach me how to do it. But at any rate, what happens is on Tet, which is the Asian New Year, there was an understanding on the part of the Americans that they weren't going to be fighting. It was kind of like they thought there was a tacit understanding with the other side that on their on our days like Christmas and Easter, we're not gonna fight. We're gonna stand down, and then on your holidays, then you'll stand down, so we won't have to worry about an attack, right? And this is why the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong decided to attack throughout Vietnam. There was a concerted offensive against all these different. You can see all these little kind of burr things here, little explosion things. Those are all the places where the Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong attacked American forces throughout Vietnam. Okay, what that's going to do is it's going to, well, first off, let me just say it this way, that the Tet Offensive by the North Vietnamese was a complete failure. The North Vietnamese army was essentially destroyed by the Americans, and the Viet Cong were left pretty much to fight a guerrilla war throughout South Vietnam. So militarily, the Tet Offensive was a victory for the United States. Okay, but what happened was that the war in Vietnam was actually televised. That people were actually in Vietnam taking pictures of the battles, and you could see that film on the evening news, right? And here, all of a sudden, we hear we're in the United States and we're sitting around our dinner table at 6 p.m. when the news comes on, and there's a huge offensive going on. There's fire all through Vietnam, and the reason why this is a problem is because the president and the generals have been telling people all along that the war is almost over. We basically won the war. We're just mopping it up right now, and then we're gonna pull all the troops out. And so people are thinking, well, yeah, the war's almost over. And then here all of a sudden there's all this fighting going on. And what that does is it creates a backlash from the point of view of the public. The public are going to say, wait a minute, you've been telling us all along this is all over, and now we find out that it's not all over. You've been lying to us. I mean, I'm shocked. The United States government lying to us, right? But the thing that you have to keep is that the mentality of this time was that people trusted the government, right? People trusted the president. And if they said something was true, they would pretty much believe it, right? But here we have all of a sudden that everything they've been saying is a lie. It's not true. And so even though this was a great military victory for the United States Armed Services, it was a huge defeat for America in Vietnam because the Americans said, we don't want to be part of this anymore. We're done with this, right? You guys get it? You get what I'm saying? Questions, comments about this? So, like I said, in 1965, when they sent troops to Vietnam, Americans were almost all for it. But by 1968, Americans are almost all against it. There's still hawks and doves, right? But the majority of the American people are against the war now, okay? Questions, comments about this? All right, okay, so now that leads to what's called the credibility gap. The credibility gap is you can't believe anything the government says, okay? And for us, I mean, that's just kind of like common knowledge, like saying the sky is blue, right? But I can tell you right now that if President Biden went on TV and said the sky is blue, there would be chyrons flashing across the country saying, well, it's not really blue, it's really all these different colors, and he's lying. You know what I'm saying? And it doesn't matter who it is. It could be Biden or Trump or whoever, right? It's going to be the same thing. Nobody trusts the government, right? How can you tell a politician is lying? His lips are moving, right? So at any rate, I mean, that's our attitude toward government. And we can really kind of trace it to this particular event, the Tet Offensive. All right, well, anyway, So now President Johnson, who had actually reluctantly gotten the United States involved in Vietnam because of the Cold War, is now coming to realize that he can't win the war in Vietnam, and that he's not going to be able to gain re-election. I guess he was elected in '64, but he's not going to be able to gain re-election. And so there are challenges within the Democratic Party. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that the party that's in power, that has a candidate who's running for re-election, like, for example, Obama in 2012 and Trump in 2020, the same party doesn't primary them, right? The same party just lets, okay, that guy's our guy, right? You get what I'm saying? But there were a couple of liberals who actually prayed Johnson, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, and Johnson will realize he's not going to win the election. He's not going to even probably be the candidate. So he, at the end of March, he announces a halt in the bombing. This is the bombing, the Operation Thunder that I talked about last week, right? He announces a halt in the bombing and calls for peace talks, and announces that he will not run for president, which throws the Democratic ticket wide open, right? You guys are with me? Questions, comments about this? Let me just mention something to you about the peace talks, all right? He called for peace talks during 1968, and he really encouraged the president of South Vietnam to participate in these peace talks with the North Vietnamese. And because it was an election year, the Republican candidate for president, who turns out to be Richard Nixon, is going to be afraid that if Johnson is able to make or to move toward peace in Vietnam, that would make him so popular that he would win the election. Nixon sends a representative to talk to the president of South Vietnam to convince him not to engage in the peace talks, and he doesn't, and so the war then will drag on for another 7 years after this, right? This is documented. People know that this is true. So you would have to actually call that an act of treason, right? Because Nixon was actually acting in favor of our enemies at that point in time. And that's something that people didn't really know until about 3 or 4 years ago, when the documents were finally unsealed, all right? Questions, comments about this? Okay. So in case anybody tells you, any of the older crowd who still believes that Nixon was a great president, that tells you that Nixon was railroaded, just realize he was not railroaded, okay? Well, anyway, the point here is that right after that, then, there's the assassination of Martin Luther King, and that's going to lead to a lot of riots in the streets. And then not too long after that, Kennedy's assassinated in Los Angeles, right? And then in 1968, they had the Democratic Convention in Chicago, which is really almost an image of America in 1968, because there's the establishment Democratic Party inside the convention center, and all the hippies and anti-war people out in the streets. And what will happen there is that the mayor of Chicago will unleash the police on the demonstrators, and that will be seen on TV, right? So what ends up happening then is that if you're looking at the 1968, you're looking at TV, you're an American citizen looking at the TV in August of 1968, and what you see is, the country that you're living in, you see there's a divide between blacks and whites. There's a divide between rich and poor. There's a divide between young and old. There's a divide between conservatives and liberals. And now we see the government forces attacking and brutalizing people in the streets you're going to say, we need law and order, right? And Nixon comes along and he says, I'm going to be your law and order president, right? And not only that, I'm going to end the war in Vietnam. I've got a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. My first secret plan is to keep it going so that I can end it, right? But but then he says, I got a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, which we never did find out what that was. And then I'm also going to be your law and order president. And that looks pretty good. So Nixon actually wins his election in 1968, barely, right? Barely. It wasn't a blowout or anything like that. But he did win. Okay, and that's going to lead then to really a whole different era in American politics. All right, not that things are going to get better, but things are going to get different.